So if you haven't been here the last couple of weeks, let me catch you up just briefly. We concluded our Easter gatherings a few weeks ago with a question, and we asked everyone to assign themselves a number, to rate yourselves on a scale of 1 to 5, particularly in regards to the resurrection of Jesus. And so we said, hey, if you're going to be a 1 on the scale, a 1 sounds like this. Someone who says, you know what, the Jesus story is a really great story. I can learn a lot from it. But the truth is, it's probably just fiction, right? It's just a Disney story. It's just a myth. It's just a feel-good type thing. And so we said, hey, this is a 1. Or we said, we want you to be, to acknowledge what a 5 might be. And a 5 would be someone who believes that Jesus was a real person, that Jesus lived in the first third of the first century, that he lived in and around the area of Jerusalem in the Middle East, that Jesus was crucified by the Romans at the request of the religious leaders in Judaism, and 3 days later on Sunday, the first day of the week, he resurrected from the dead, that he was fully dead on Friday, no heartbeat, no brain function, completely dead, that his body started the decomposition process. And on Sunday, that was reversed in a physical, literal resurrection, that the 2 feet he walked out of the grave on were the same 2 feet that they put nails in to nail him to the cross, right? And that Jesus, because of those 2 things, proves he's the Son of God. And those 2 things give us an avenue to make a right relationship with God. So that's what a 5 looks like. And so we just said, hey, everybody put yourself on the scale somewhere. Just be honest with yourself where you're at 1 to 5. We defined 1, we defined 5. You get to put yourself somewhere on there. And then we followed that question up with, what would it take? What are the questions you have in your life about faith, the Bible, whatever it is? What are those questions that you need answered, or you feel like you need to have an answer or more study, more insight into, that help you move at least 1, if not 2, numbers to the towards being a 5, right? So if you're 4 below, what are the questions? We put a QR code on the screen, and people scan the QR code, and they submitted anonymously a little over 110 questions. I think 112 or 114 questions is what was submitted. And so we've taken those questions, and we've cleared our teaching calendar for about 6 or 7 weeks, and we've put those questions into categories that we are attempting to answer in one kind of teaching time at a time. And so for the last couple of weeks, we've dug into, is the Bible reliable? Is it trustworthy? Is it historically accurate? Last week, we looked at the possibility that science and miracles in the Bible, how could they be integrated to one another? Do they contradict one another? We took a stab at looking at that entire case from a biblical and a scientific state or a point of view. And so those are the last 2 weeks. Today, we come to probably one of the most common questions that's asked just in terms of my life as a pastor. It's one of the most common questions that's asked, and it's really a 2-part question. The first one is this: what happens after you die? It's part 1. Part 2, how could a loving God send people to hell? Right? What happens after you die, and how could a loving God send people to hell? Well, when we take a look at death as a whole, we see from a biblical perspective that death has some kind of connection in terms of punishment or an outcome. It's a result of something. In fact, Romans says this: for the wages of sin is death. And so if we read the biblical narrative, we see that at first, God didn't intend for death to be a part of the normal, everyday occurrence of his creation. But sin enters into the world, and a natural outcome or result of that sin is death. We get to define that even more in the New Testament, but that's probably one of the greatest summary statements that we find in terms of making sure we understand what death is and why death is. The wages of sin is death. In other words, death and sin are very much so connected to one another. From a biblical standpoint, there it is. And so we see death is part of punishment, right? And that every single person goes through this idea of death. I was reading over the last couple of weeks as I was prepping for this particular Sunday, and I came across a writing from a professor at Ozark Christian College, and I thought it was really interesting what he had to say about it. And he didn't just say, hey, death is a punishment. He actually had this point of view that said, could death be seen as a mercy? And this is what he said. He said, imagine if humans, now with an evil, rebellious bent, could just be as cruel as our imaginations could take us without ever feeling the need to make things right with God. He said, maybe death becomes a mercy because it triggers, or it's a catalyst for something inside of us that says, you know what? I probably ought to think through, how do I get right with God if there is one? In other words, maybe I shouldn't follow my deepest, darkest desires, even if in the fits of my rage, or in my anger, or in my disappointment, or in my willingness or needingness to get even or enact revenge. That maybe in those moments, there's something else that ought to kind of ignite inside of me that says, there could be a God that I need to get right with. And then maybe death is a mercy in that way. I think it can be seen as a mercy, but the truth is, no matter what we see death is, the Bible paints a really clear picture. Death is not the way things are meant to be. In fact, the church planter Paul says this: the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Paul sees it as an enemy, as a consequence, as an outcome. So much so that death itself ought to be destroyed. But not yet, right? So many of us, probably just recently, have probably had someone we care about, or a coworker, that has experienced death. So what happens after you die? What does the Bible say? Now, I'll be honest with you. I've wrestled with how to make this shorter. At the 9, I wrestled and I failed. I lost. And so you showed up to parking lots that were full and I've made some adjustments for the 11. And so we're going to move, okay? But my struggle was there is so much biblical content that talks about what happens after you die. It's just difficult, and I just struggled. I just struggled to find a way to summarize it all, to kind of put a systematic or an orderly way to walk us from what the Bible says in a million different places and kind of help connect some dots on a few truths. And so I'm not sure I've done an incredible job at doing that, but I do feel like I've made some good adjustments from the 9, so you won't have to suffer as long as the 9 to get the same point across. What we find, or what we want to start, is what happens immediately after we die. If the Bible gives us any insight, the very last moment that we take a breath and our eyes close and our hearts stop beating and our brains cease to function, is there any insight that tells us what happens in that moment? Paul says this: for me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. If I'm to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I don't know. I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Paul seems to be saying that, hey, here's the thing. I'm aware of what my purpose is in this life, and I feel like I'm pulling off my purpose, and then I'm adding to the purpose of other people, and that is all well and good, but I've also tasted the goodness of Jesus, and I'm drawn to who he is and where he is. And so I'm torn between this idea of continuing in a purpose where I'm fulfilled and also entering into a new place of communion or presence of Jesus. Now, Paul says, to be honest with you, if I stack up my purpose and my presence here on this particular side of death and all of the satisfaction that I have from occurring in this life, if I pile it all up and then I pile up what I only know to be true of Jesus, this is still better. And the thing is, Paul doesn't actually know everything about Jesus. He only knows what he's been told and his personal experience with Jesus. There is so much more to the catalyst of creation than that. But even in his small dose of Jesus, he has come to a place where when he weighs it on the scales, this is so much heavier. I know that looks backwards to you. What heavier means is bigger, right? This is on the bottom. He says death actually brings gain. Paul seems to write that death brings him to Jesus. says, I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. He describes our current life in a way that might seem interesting to you. He says this in 2 Corinthians 5, for we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. He compares what we're living in, our bodies, as a tent. Just a tent, you know? And I don't know, anybody tent camp? Yeah, y'all tent campers every once in a while? I was a Boy Scout, Eagle Scout. How about them apples? You know what I'm saying? On my honor, I could do the whole thing, I think, maybe. I don't know, we'll see. Don't put me on the spot. You know what I'm talking about? You get in a tent, and the tent is just fine. And it's raining, and it's fine. And then you touch the tent. Anybody know what I'm talking about? What happens? What happens when you touch the tent and it's raining? Water comes in the tent. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's no signs that says, don't touch me when I'm wet. It just what happens. Paul says, hey, here's the deal. We got a tent, and our tent's going to have issues. But when the tent's done, when we're done with it, he says we have a building from God, an eternal house, a home in heaven, not built by human hands. Now, he's not talking about, hey, mansions of glory, those whole things. He's talking about bodies, right? He said he's comparing a tent to a home, a tent to a building, a tent to a house, eternal, one not built by human hands. He continues, therefore, we are always confident and know that as long as we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we live by faith, not by sight. We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. I think that's a really good way to summarize it. Away from the body is home with the Lord. It seems like Jesus agrees and believes in the same thing. There's a moment Jesus is hanging on the cross, and there's criminals on his left and on his right, and they're having some back and forth a little bit, mostly just there back at Jesus, and Jesus is just giving them looks in the fourth part. So they're back and forth a little bit, and there's one that's just not happy with Jesus or happy with life or that life is ending. He's just really upset. There's another guy, though, who seems to be coming around to the idea that Jesus might be a little more significant than the people who put him on the cross thinks he is significant. And he says this to Jesus, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Away from the body is at home with the Lord. Now, what's really interesting is that we have that thought process that, hey, when we breathe our last and our eyes close for the last time and our brain stops functioning, that we have this statement from Paul, we have this innuendo, this insight from Jesus. But we also have to make sure that we manage that with the other parts of the New Testament that talk about that there's something else that takes place after death. And it's not only, hey, I've closed my eyes on this life and I've opened my eyes with Jesus. To be absent from the body is to be present from the Lord. There's also this understanding that there's a resurrection that's coming. And the resurrection doesn't take place upon death. The resurrection is something that all of us continue to wait for. Paul says this, brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. And so he's just saying, hey, there's a couple things I want to make sure that we're clear on as we start to walk through this resurrection piece. Because we believe in a resurrection, we also can grieve, which is a natural process, but we don't grieve like the rest of the world who grieves without hope. We grieve with hope. In other words, grief is completely acceptable. It's very normal. Anyone who tries to tell you that, oh, don't worry, they're in a better place, and that's supposed to dry up your tears and make you feel better about it, that doesn't make any sense. No, you are welcome to hit the floor on your knees and cry your eyes out because you're experiencing loss, and that is a normal and a healthy thing. The difference is that when your knees hit the ground, the foundation that you are bent down on and you're crying into that's soaking up your tears, that is hope. It's not just dirt, but your foundation is built on a hope of resurrection, a hope of eternal life, a hope of new life. And so, yes, grief continues to come, and grief is something that we experience in very intimate parts of who we are. And grief takes a long time. Grief is a process, but the truth is it's not permanent. He continues about resurrection. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet with the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. In other words, resurrection is coming. Now, this always brings us to a place to ask, what about cremation? Like, is that an okay thing? Is that an all right thing? Because for sure, like all the stuff that we're reading in the Bible is like, hey, we're about to raise you out of a grave. We're going to pull you out of a grave. You know what I'm saying? Like, I ran out of that grave. You know, we just sang the song, you know. Not I ran out of the jar on the mantle. You know, that's not it. Grave. Now, what we know, when we understand about the Bible, or we just look through history, cremation was the normal way that a lot of folks in the Roman Empire were taken care of. We see a pretty huge stop to this practice right around the 4th century when Christianity becomes a pretty big deal in the Roman Empire. And it's because people are afraid that, hey, if we burn the body up and we put ashes somewhere, we spread them in a lake or a river or someplace like that, that God's not going to be able to find us. And so when he comes to knock on the grave, we're not going to be there. You know what I'm saying? Which totally disregards that he created the entire world out of nothing, right? And so for sure, if he knows the number of hairs on our head and he put everything, and he's got galaxies spinning that we will never discover, that he still orchestrates and oversees, he hasn't misplaced you, right? In fact, when we look through the history of the way that Christians were interacted with, there are Christians that were fed to wild animals. And those wild animals, I mean, who knows what happens to them? Or maybe they just poop them all over creation. I don't know. And so you were in multiple places all over. There were emperors, there were leaders in the Roman Empire that would put Christians on a stake and light them on fire for torches for their parties. And then they would discard the bodies. So I'm telling you, there's no telling where the ashes and the pieces of followers of Jesus are all over the world. That's not a barrier. That's not a barrier for Jesus. I say all that to say, don't put me in a cremation thingamajigger. Put me in a box, okay? Look, my wife's in the back. This is on record. We're putting this on the YouTubes. Don't burn me, girl, okay? Put me in a box. That way, if someone made a mistake, I can still yell loud and knock and get myself out, okay? Y'all better put a shovel in there with me too, okay? Is that doable? Can we put a shovel in there? Okay, great. Paul continues. Our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await a Savior from there, the Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. Now, he says, hey, not only is there going to be a resurrection, it's not just going to be this resurrected spirit. Like the actual body itself is being resurrected. Which I know when you think through, well, how does he put the ashes back together? What happens if it happened at sea and there were, like, who knows, like the torches, the animals, like there's a lot of things that happen. Like, how does he do that? The Bible doesn't give us the specifics of how God makes that happen. It just says that's what he's going to do. and that the body that we receive will be like the body that Jesus walked out of the grave in. Similar, but also different. And the truth is, maybe you're wondering, you're like, hold on. Now, so if we're following this, we've got absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. But then at some point, Jesus is coming back and there's a resurrection of all people, right? So why do we even need the resurrection of all people if it's absent from the body is present with the Lord, right? Why do we need that? Why not just, if we're already kind of enjoying the presence of Jesus, why not just continue in that? Like, why do we need to push pause and say, hey guys, end of the world's coming. So we're going to push pause on this. This is nice. I'm going to go. I got to get everybody else. You get in a body, and you getting your bodies back, and let's just put pause on what we're doing. Like, why do we have to do that? Actually, that's probably the easiest answer of all the questions we've got. And it's found in 1 Corinthians 15. He says this, "For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For the perishable must clothe itself with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" You see, the thing is if we lose the body, death wins the body. And Jesus isn't going to lose. Yeah, one of the consequences, the occurrences, the results of sin is death. And so Jesus is saying, look, here's the deal. I'm playing for keeps, and I'm keeping it all. So death doesn't get to keep your bodies. I want them. And so what death has destroyed, I will make new. What death has taken from you, I'm going to give it back and make it even better. Now, the truth is, we can talk about what happens. We can talk about what our bodies are going to be like. What does glorious mean? What does it look like for us to be resurrected? There's another part, though, right? There's another part we haven't touched on. We start to see it a little bit in Hebrews. It says this, "Just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment, so Christ was sacrificed once to take away the sins of many. And he will appear a second time, not to bear sin, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him." So now we have this introduction that there's a judgment that's going to take place. That it's not only death, present or absent from the body, is present with the Lord, then resurrection, and there's a glorious body, and we're going to defeat death. Even the issues with the body that death has created, we're going to undo all those things. There's judgment that happens. But the positive part is that Jesus says, I'm showing up a second time. I'm showing up a second time. Not to bear your sin, because I already did that, but to bring salvation to those who are waiting on him. And honestly, that's the good part. That's where we want to stop. It's like, yeah, this is good. Everybody dies, present with the Lord, resurrection, Jesus shows up, salvation is here. Let's stop right there. But that's actually not the whole picture. There's a guy named John, a really good friend of Jesus, and he was given a privilege of having a vision of what this end times moment looks like. And he records it for us in the book of Revelation. He says this, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them." I just want to stop there for a second. It says the earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. What we're beginning to see is that there's a new heaven and a new earth. And it wasn't only that Jesus was redeeming our bodies, it was that the earth itself groans for redemption, and that the creation itself, the old way of create, that even it will be fixed and repaired and made new. Verse 12, "And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and the death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. The lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. I just want you to picture this for a second. John is seeing this vision of what this judgment moment is going to look like. And the very first thing that he points out is that there was this great white throne, that makes sense. Like, okay, that's probably the brightest spot in the room. That's where our eyes are drawn to. That makes sense. But did you see what it also says? It says, and then I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. In other words, like all the dead, like every single one of them, all the billions and billions of people that's ever lived, great and small, rich and poor, masters and slaves, oppressors and the oppressed, all of them, every single person standing in front of the throne. I don't know how many people that's. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people. I don't know if you know what a lot of people looks like. That's a lot of people. And the very first thing, though, the very first thing that was brought to his attention that stood out to him was the size of the throne. Think about how big that throne's got to be considered great in the presence of the billions of people that have ever walked the earth. How large does the throne got to be the thing that stands out for you the most? Or how large does it have to be able to even see it among the billions of people who are standing there? It's quite the scene. It says there were books that were open, and in those books were the actions that were taken. It says the dead were judged according to what they had done. It was recorded in the books. I don't know what this is like. That's a long line to judge every single person on all the things they do. Maybe there's an express line. I don't know. I'm not sure how it works. Or maybe it happens. I don't know. I don't know if they put it on video screen so everybody can see all your bad stuff. I don't know if it's first person point of view and they get to see what you. I have no idea. But sure enough, there's books. But then it said there's another book that was opened. Another book that was opened, which was the book of life. And it ends with anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. This echoes what we see Jesus teach multiple times. He's telling a story one time, trying to communicate with people how real this is. And he's talking about sheep and goats and that they will separate them. And he gives them a couple other stories where he's just trying to make sense or allow people to make sense of what's happening. And so he's got one thing that's going one way and one thing that's going the other. And there's fire there. And so he's just trying to put it in terms for everyone to understand. But he ends one of these stories with this. Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. And so Jesus puts it in those terms. He says, hey, there's eternal punishment or eternal life. And this is where we get the big question. How could a loving God send people to eternal punishment? How could a loving God send people to a lake of fire? How could a loving God send people to hell? We do so much work in the church to unveil to people that God is love. And this makes it really difficult, doesn't it? In fact, a lot of times we would just prefer not to talk about it. Which maybe is why there were so many people that had questions about it. I'll tell you, this has been a question that's been asked of me even before I was a pastor. I remember I was just a volunteer worship leader at a church, and people came and asked me this question. I don't know. Why are you asking me? I just play songs. I don't know. I tell you though, I started looking for an answer. And I found one, and I think it's the greatest answer to the question. It wasn't my idea. I didn't write it. For sure, it's by someone much, much smarter than I am. His name is C.S. Lewis. And I think he gives the greatest answer to this question. He says it like this. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done. And those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. In other words, he's saying, hey, I'm not forcing you to do anything. I've just given you a choice. And your choice is that simple. My will be done or your will be done. And I'm going to honor your choice. I'm going to respect the decision that you made. Now, we might not like that God's the one who decided what the choice was. Well, that's something you'll have to take up with God. All I can tell you is that this is what we have. But let's ask a couple of clarifying questions with that. Since when did God start forcing people to do what he wants them to do? When did he start that? Is that what we would prefer? Because that's kind of inferred in the question. Why would God send someone to hell? Well, have you ever asked someone if they actually wanted to go to heaven? Most of the time, it's a theoretical question, right? It's like, well, what if I know someone? Surely they won't send them to hell. I don't know. Did you ask them? I've had conversations with people, and they say, look, here's the deal. If I've got to serve God, that sounds more like hell than hell does. I'd rather just go to hell. I'll take my chances. Have you asked them? Or are you just assuming and speaking for them? In fact, the question in and of itself shows that there's a little bit of faith. Like, you know what? Maybe there is something to this. Now, I don't agree with it, or I'm angry at God for making it this way, or I'm upset, or I don't see the logic behind it, or I don't understand how the dots connect, but this I don't enjoy this part of it. I mean, if God were to say, fine, you can go to heaven, but you've got to submit to me, would they want to go? Maybe life this side of death, that is everything we want at any moment, is more valuable to some people than heaven. Like maybe the freedom here to just do what you want and think what you want and be what you want and say what you want and act how you want just is more valuable than the prospect of heaven. Or maybe we don't want God to exist, and honestly, that's a reasonable want. I get it. But a lesson that we probably all started learning pretty close after we were born was that we don't always get what we want. And just because we want something doesn't mean we can will something. Here's what everyone wants. Revelation 21:4. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Everybody's on that page, right? Doesn't matter. Like everybody's on that page. Like, yeah, let's get that done. I mean, honestly, when we use the phrase pass away, right? Aren't the things that pass away in our lives the people that we care about? And when we use that phrase, like, yeah, they passed away. My grandmother passed away. My so-and-so passed away. We lost them. Isn't it nice to finally use that phrase with the things we actually want to pass away? Death, that's great. Mourning, crying, pain, all four of those things, they passed away. And then we're going to throw a party for eternity for it. Everybody's on verse 4's page. Everybody wants verse 4. The thing is that verse 4 can only exist if verses 1 through 3 are true. And that's the important thing. So everybody gets on the verse 4 page, but verse 4 only can take place if verses 1, 2, and 3 are true. Verse 1, 2, and 3. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God." The important part is honestly the end of verse 3. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. So if you want verse 4, right, you got to have the end of verse 3. Let me read them together to you. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. You see, God's the one doing the tear wiping. God's the one that's causing death and mourning and pain to pass away. God's the catalyst for that. He's the cause of it. God's presence among his people. But the truth is, historically, the people of God haven't wanted this. In the very beginning, we see Adam and Eve in the garden, and God is with them, and God lives and dwells with them. And they decide they prefer to eat from this one particular tree and not have fellowship in the same way with God. They prefer that. And so they say, hey, here's the deal. We're going to change things up a little bit. We fast forward a little bit. And the people of God are being led by God. And God is out front, and God's showing them, this is the way we're going to do things, and this way I'm going to lead you. And eventually they get tired of God leading them and say, hey, you're great and all. You're fantastic. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us. We sure would like a king, though. Like, you've been great. You've done a really great job. But all the other nations, all the other peoples of the earth, they've got a king. We sure would like a king. And then we fast forward a little bit more, and actually God puts on flesh. His name is Jesus, and he's the incarnation. He walks around among us, and what do we do with him? We kill him. Every time God draws near, we do something stupid. And here's the thing, the people doing the stupid stuff, it's the people of God. That's what he promises, though. That's what heaven looks like. And he will dwell with them. They will be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. You know, one of the greatest gifts we have is death. The psalmist convinces me of this. He says this, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. You see, death might be a mercy. Death ends up being a pretty incredible gift, because the reality of our own mortality causes us to wrestle with, I need an answer to this question. What happens when I stop breathing and my heart stops beating and my brain stops functioning? What happens? Is it absent from the body and present with the Lord? Is it just nothing? Will I experience what it was like when the Revolutionary War was taking place? I don't remember that. It didn't bother me that I wasn't alive when the Revolutionary War was taking place, so it probably won't bother me that I'm not here in the future, right? It just won't. Didn't bother me then, it won't bother me then. Is that what the answer is? Is there something else that us humans haven't yet uncovered? There's some deep, dark secret hanging out in some pyramid somewhere. If we could only get to it, we would find out what the secret of the universe is. I think it's a question worth exploring. And I think it's a question that you deserve to come to a conclusion on. Because your conclusion, even if it's a little bit inaccurate, will cause action. Now, if you're asking me, I've presented what I think is trustworthy about the Bible presents is this is what happens when we die. And so if you ask me, that's what I'll walk you through. But the truth is, don't put your faith in me. Just put your faith in Jesus. And if you're not going to put your faith in Jesus, honestly, you're the next best thing you got. Don't trust anybody else. You need to do the digging and the discovery because it's your life and it's your death. And whatever's after death, that also belongs to you. And so you've got to come to a conclusion. Now, I don't think I've done as good of a job because I've caught myself twice. I didn't want to have this conversation and have much emotion, and I really wanted to just present a case because I know that when we talk about death and hell and heaven, that it has a tendency, especially when we talk about hell, to cause people to say, I don't want that. Let me do whatever this guy's going to tell me to do so I feel better when I sleep tonight, right? And I don't think that's a healthy way to follow Jesus, which is really just running from something you're scared of, you know? And so I didn't want it to be, hopefully this section here is going to kill any emotion that's in the room because I don't want there to be any emotion around the decision. But I do want there to be a decision for every single one of you. It says, hey, do I want to follow Jesus or not? Not just because he's got some information about what he claims happens after we die, but because you realize that your life is worth living now, and he's got some incredible information about what to do in these moments. And so we want to make it simple. We're not going to have an altar call for somebody to come up here, and that's what we're going to do. We're just going to make it simple. If you want to begin a conversation, then you can just text the word begin to the number we're going to throw on the screen. I would encourage you just to take out your phone and take a picture of it, because you might find, you know what, you're going to go to lunch or whatever, and you're having a conversation with someone, and you're like, you know what, I think I do want to explore what a next step of giving my life to Jesus is. And then you'll have the number. And if you miss it, right, if you're like, man, I don't remember what the number is, and I didn't take the picture even though he told me to because I just thought he was stupid and I knew more, like even if that happens, Google is your friend, and just Google our church, and it'll have a number on there. It's the wrong number for this, but I'll get it, or someone on our staff will get it. And you can still text the same word, begin. And if you can't remember the key word, just text something that tells us something about you want to have a conversation, right? Don't make it complicated. And we can start just exploring. What do you want to discover? What do you want to find out? Are you ready to make a decision about not just after death, but a decision about life today? In the coming weeks, with every breath that God has already sees and understands you will be given. Do you want to give all of that to Jesus? And honestly, I think that's probably the more exhilarating thing than what happens after death. Because it's now. It's right now.